Are your orchid fertilizing mistakes killing your orchids? Well, some of these mistakes we have all made, and others some of us will always make. Let's look at how to overcome these mistakes to ensure we can fertilize for healthy growth. Welcome to the Nature Company. Today we're going to look into why fertilizer is important for your orchids. And we'll also look into the danger of over-fertilization. We'll be helping you choose the correct fertilizer for your orchids and giving you application tips to ensure you're choosing the right fertilizer and fertilizing for healthy growth. If this is the kind of information you're interested in, please hit that subscribe button down below and that notification bell. Be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. So let's understand why fertilizer is going to be important for the growth of your orchids. First, we need to understand orchids are epiphytic. They grow out on the trees, their roots are there exposed, and the only nutrition they're getting is from water and the air. So the water's from the rain rushing down the tree and whatever they can absorb through the atmosphere itself. This is as opposed to other plants who are absorbing all that nutrition through the ground. And growing orchids in pots indoors, they're not going to be getting any of that natural food, so we're going to have to supplement them. This is going to give them all those nutrients they need to grow. The nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, calcium, magnesium, and all those other micronutrients that they need to grow and flourish and produce these beautiful blooms. So in other words, since Mother Nature can't feed them, we have to be their mothers and feed them ourselves. By feeding them, we're going to ensure that they get healthy roots, healthy top growth, beautiful flowers, and continue to thrive. But in this, we've always got to remember that there's dangers in feeding. Especially with us using these fertilizers, we can easily overfeed our orchids, and this can lead to incredible amounts of problems in growing. So us being the mothers of our orchids now, we have to be sure we don't overfeed them, because there can be dire consequences from overfeeding. Firstly, high concentrations of fertilizers can burn the roots and the leaves of your plant and damage them terribly. This will then reduce its ability to absorb nutrients and use them, and that will stunt its growth. Also, you'll land up with a salt buildup in the media. That too is going to be detrimental in several different ways. Certain orchids are particularly susceptible to high salt concentrations in the media, and they just don't make it. Also, these high salt contents in your media will make it difficult for the orchid to absorb moisture, and those high salts are going to start causing problems with different nutrients being able to be absorbed by the orchid itself. So you're going to land up with all sorts of different problems other than the media souring and decomposing quickly. So overfeeding is going to be a big no-no. And as the toxic buildup of salts happen in your media, your leaves are going to start to yellow, eventually die and fall off. Your roots will rot and your whole plant will be stunted and probably die. So if that's not enough to stop you from overfeeding, there's also going to be other problems that it can cause before it gets to that point, where the nutrient balance gets upset and your orchid is no longer able to absorb certain nutrients because other nutrients are in too high concentrations. We'll explain more on that at the end, where we tell you a bit about the different nutrients and what their deficiencies and excesses are going to do to your plant. Now that we've all become paranoid now that we're going to overfeed our orchids, what fertilizer do we do to actually feed our orchids to get the best out of them? A balanced fertilizer is generally going to be the best idea, especially if you've chosen an orchid fertilizer that's specifically formulated for orchids. You've taken a step in the right direction. Let's look a little bit more into that. So for beginners, it's generally recommended to go for something easy like one of those general fertilizers, the 10-10-10 or the 20-20-20, something where those NPK values are the same across the board. This just makes it easier, and remember, stick to your manufacturer's mixing instruction. We'll look into more tips on the application shortly, but let's just look deeper into these fertilizers. As you get more advanced, you may want to change up or tweak your fertilizer regime slightly. And looking at the internal makeup of the orchid cells themselves, we notice orchids generally need that touch more nitrogen than what those pure balanced fertilizers will give you. And if you're looking for the right ratios, you're probably looking at something like a 3-1-2 to get the maximum growth out of your orchids. One of the reasons that the phosphorus levels are so low with the orchids is because generally the phosphorus levels in general fertilizers is generally bumped up because in the ground chemical reactions take place and make less of that phosphorus available to the plant. So they have to just bump that up to overcome that soil microbial action to allow for enough phosphorus for the plant. So in orchids, we're not going to have that same sort of problem. So we want to just have our phosphorus levels slightly lower because we've always got to be aware in using fertilizers where your phosphorus and potassium levels are too high constantly, because those can then be toxic to your orchid, especially if there are buildups. You may want to use bloom boosters at certain periods of the year, but remember, only use them for a very short period. Continued use is going to start being problematic. Now, knowing a little bit more, and we've chosen our fertilizers, how do we apply them? As a beginner, it's often suggested to only feed every second watering or just once a month with your waterings in between. This is to ensure that you are not overfeeding. It will allow you to water with fresh, clean water to flush out any excess salts. One of the ways that you can overcome this as well, and as you start getting advanced in your growing, you'll start wanting to fertilize more frequently, and in doing so, you'll have to reduce the concentrations of your feed. So then you're going to be using half or even a quarter strength of the recommended dosage to feed your orchids, but you're going to be feeding them with almost every watering, and then you're going to be making sure that at least once a month you're going to be giving those a thorough flushing with fresh, clean water to ensure, again, you don't have any salt or excess nutrient buildup in your media. That's going to then damage your roots or cause problems with your plant itself. So now let's have a look at some of those nutrients your orchid requires and the effect that those deficiencies or excesses are going to cause in your orchid. First, we'll start off with is the biggest one, nitrogen. If you've got sufficient amounts of nitrogen available for your plant, it's going to allow for those growth hormones to be produced. And that's what's going to give you the beautiful, lush growth in your plant. As the amount of nitrogen available to your plant declines, so the hormone balance will change slightly. And what's going to start happening is the senescence hormone is going to take over, causing leaf drop. And your orchid will slowly start losing its leaves. And as the deficiency sets in, so you'll notice the whole growth of your plant slow down. But as nitrogen is one of those motile nutrients, the orchid can move it around. It will start removing it from those older leaves first and pushing it up into the newer growth to try and ensure the newer growth can stay alive for as long as possible. And then slowly all those older leaves will fall off first. And they'll slowly go a pale green, and then yellow, and eventually brown and die. And also what's going to happen with that nitrogen deficiency is your orchid is going to want to look for as much nitrogen as possible so it lands up producing more roots. So you're going to land up with a higher root volume than you might have had otherwise, as the plant sends out those roots to look for more available nitrogen. And then what's going to happen if there's too much nitrogen? Is my plant just going to explode in growth? Yes and no. What's going to happen with too much nitrogen? You're going to get really, really dark green leaves. Your leaves are going to be broader, they're going to be longer, but they are also going to be thinner, and they'll give that distinct droopiness to them. This is also going to make them more susceptible to fungal attacks. Also, the roots to your orchid are going to be a lot smaller and thinner, and a lot more closely bunched up together. in a way to try and avoid as much of that nitrogen as possible so it doesn't have to bring any more of it up, and to try and avoid any toxic effects from overfeeding. And with that phosphorus I was warning you about earlier, what is a deficiency going to look like in an orchid? Well, your deficiencies are going to cause a lot slower growth because it's going to affect your photosynthesis and your protein synthesis. So your orchid is going to grow a lot more slowly. So as the deficiency continues, you'll land up with darker green leaves, and you'll land up with sort of red purplish discoloration on the leaves as well. And with the hormone imbalances, you're going to land up with delayed flowering or even possible bud fall. So deficiencies are not something you want in phosphorus. With an excess of phosphorus, you're going to land up with your plant reaching maturity a lot faster. You're going to land up with a much more extensive root system, but then it will start building up to toxic levels. So just to watch out for. And with potassium, the deficiencies in potassium are generally noticed in those older leaves first, because potassium is one of those nutrients that can also be moved around the plant really, really easily. And as soon as there's potassium stress, it's going to take it out from the older leaves and push it up to the newer growth to ensure the survival of the plant. And what's going to happen is you'll start to lose turgidity in the leaf. The leaf will become wrinkled and get softer and bend over. It's going to cause it to be a lot more easily attacked by fungus. And it's not only going to be the leaves, it's the roots as well. The roots can rot extremely easily when there is a potassium deficiency. But when you have excess potassium, you're going to land up with all sorts of other problems. The excess potassium is going to affect your calcium and magnesium uptake. And we all know how important calcium and magnesium is for your orchids. And by interfering with the calcium and magnesium uptake, you're going to land up with all the problems of deficiencies in those two nutrients. That brings us straight onto your calcium. Calcium deficiencies can be very problematic. Calcium is absorbed up through the roots of the plant and then placed in those cell membranes and cell walls where it is immotile. It's not going to be able to be taken up by the plant again and moved to other areas. So once it's settled down, it stays there for good. So now the plant doesn't have any more calcium to move to those new growth points. What's going to happen is that new growth, as it starts to come out, edges are generally initially going to be a lighter color, and you're going to get sort of like a twisted appearance. The edges may curl inwards, and as your calcium deficiency prolongs, you're going to land up with black necrotic areas on that new growth until probably the whole growth blackens and dies off. This is often mistaken for black rot in orchids, but often it's just a calcium deficiency. So be sure to check that out. And with calcium deficiency, your roots are incredibly affected by it. The new roots just rot and die off, and the older roots go brown, squishy, and then die too. So calcium is an important nutrient to be fertilizing your orchid with. But again, don't overdo it. Excess calcium is going to cause a nutrition block. It blocks up everything, and your plant just doesn't seem to be able to absorb any of the nutrients it needs. So make sure you're not overfeeding on your calcium. And overfeeding with calcium can also produce the same effects as what calcium deficiency looks like. So you've got to be very careful. You're going to land up with something that looks like black rot and your roots will die, but it's not from lack of calcium, it's from overfeeding with calcium. So be careful of that. Now, magnesium deficiency. This is going to affect the photosynthesis and protein synthesis as well, which is going to reduce your plant's vigor and stunt the growth, so you're not going to land up with very happy plants. But overfeeding with magnesium too much magnesium, magnesium in excess is going to be toxic to your plant. Not only is it going to build up toxicity levels, it's going to stop your calcium from being absorbed. It's going to interfere with the calcium uptake and cause those calcium deficiencies because you've given it too much magnesium. And with the majority of the other micronutrients, the possibilities of deficiencies is generally quite rare, and the possibilities of overfeeding is also quite rare because invariably you'll be overfeeding it with one of the other nutrients for the plant, for your orchid anyway, which is going to cause the problems first. So fertilizing orchids for healthy growth is a balancing act. The best way to do it, especially when you're starting out, is to keep a record of which days you've fed and which days you've watered and how much you have fed, so that you can make sure when you're watching your orchid, you can pick up if there's any deficiencies or any of those signs of overfeeding. That way you'll know how to adjust your feeding regime to suit your orchids, your environment, and the way that you look after them. And we'd like to send a big shout out and thank you to Mary Claire Griffith for becoming our latest member. We really appreciate you going out your way to help the orchids. And if you have any queries about what we've been talking about, please drop it in the comments box down below, and go have a look at that Buy Me a Coffee link in the description box, where Ed posts up a lot of information on all manner of different orchid topics. Don't be shy, sign up, become a member, and grow like a pro. Thank you for watching. If you found any of this information helpful, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button down below, and that notification bell, bing bong, to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.